All right, hello everyone. My name is Brian Vines. I'm sitting here in the historic Hawthorne Barn in lovely Provincetown, Massachusetts, and I'm glad that you're joining me today. This is going to be interesting and I hope fun and maybe even thought-provoking, conversation starting. We can begin some dialogue and hopefully we'll leave with a lot of questions that leave us curious to learn a little bit more. So I'm just going to give everyone a second to come into the room and get settled. Thanks for spending part of this lovely Saturday, at least in P-Town, after a few cloudy days. That made for some good research time. So again, thank you for being here. My name is Brian Vines, and I have the great fortune to be one of the residents here at 20 Summers. They're an organization that sponsors creativity and new thought and dialogue for artists of so many different backgrounds and mediums, and I'm really glad that I got a chance to participate in the program for this season with my cohort of amazing folks who I hoped you got a chance to see some of their work and their conversation too. And just want to let you know that you can actually engage with me as we go through this process by asking any question you'd like and dropping it down in the chat. So from the beginning, I had an idea of something that I'd like to do when given the space. And then 20 Summers stepped in with just that. An idea to come and work through some questions and let ideas flow freely without the pressure of a deadline or even really a delivery outside of sharing with you. So I do want to say that this is a work in progress, and progress is probably a very loose term, but it's moving on, but it really is just something that I'm working through, and I hope that we can work through it together for a little bit. The title of what I've been working on loosely is Hello Neighbor, just examining the issue of climate migration through the lens of community media. And before we get into it in earnest, I thought I would share a clip of a woman from New Orleans, Louisiana, a place that's near and dear to my heart, speaking to a news crew, and it went viral, but it is something that's very sweet and really central to this question of climate migration and what it means in the American context and the way the media handles it. So have a look at Miss Constance.
Constance Landry, she says she's lived here her entire life, almost 80 years, been through just about everything.
Ain't no 80 years old.
Well, just about. I'm sorry, Miss Constance. 76 to be exact.
No, 75.
75. Are you coming back to New Orleans and New Orleans East?
Is the elephant heavy? I'm coming back, baby.
So I toyed with the idea of calling this talk Is an Elephant Heavy? Outside of the age, Miss Constance is a person who survived both Hurricane Katrina and a tornado that ravaged her neighborhood, and both times she found herself back in the town of her birth of nearly 80 years, not quite, but she's a New Orleans resident. And she had to leave, and she came back, and she left, and she came back. So this idea of climate migration, working toward a definition of what a climate migrant is in the first place, is something that has become pretty fraught politically, but it seems like the definition is something that you feel with your heart before you even have the words for it. But there are some words, as agreed to in the UN's Migration Agency. I want to read this to you. Environmental migrants are persons or groups of persons who predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment that adversely affects their lives or living conditions, are obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently, and who move either within their country or abroad. So this idea of an American climate migrant and moving toward a definition of what that exactly means, since there is no real legal definition of what a climate migrant is. And in the absence of that, we're allowed to make it all things to all people who've had to move. Now, we know in America there's been lots of people who've been moved, and that's the story of the Americans from the time that some settlers arrived here and did some things. But we're talking specifically about climate migration in this context. And I think a great starting point is to look at the 1930s and the Dust Bowl. So in 1930, and a few times it happened over the course of the dirty 30s, as they came to be known, when agricultural methods in America were not as well-reasoned or scientific as they are today, when the top layer of soil was something that became eroded over the course of the agricultural practices that were happening in America, when this idea of manifest destiny and people going out west and settling land meant a lot of the grassland that was there was changed and converted for agricultural purposes. And America's breadbasket essentially became the Dust Bowl because of the lack of proper planning. So 1934, 1936, we've actually got some videos there of the Dust Bowl that will give you an idea of those sort of scenes of all the chaos and people really being forced off of their land because it was just inhospitable to living. The Dust Bowl captured America's popular imagination after it was done, of course, but if you think of The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, the music of Woody Guthrie, and the photos of Dorothea Lange, those things come to mind when folks who are on the roadside in the midst of America's greatest single migration that we had ever seen. Just some of the numbers on the Dust Bowl. Thousands of people left the regions of Texas, and I've got some notes here to keep me honest. So 2.5 million people left Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. And of those 2.5 million who made their way into the open road, about 250,000 of those folks settled in California. And they became known as the Okies. Now, Okie might be something that gets associated with football teams or a goofy person nowadays, but those folks who were climate migrants from the Dust Bowl who wound up in California often found themselves on the end of some very harsh living conditions as the economy collapsed in the 30s and they couldn't find work. Okies were often given the lowest paid jobs, they had the worst living conditions, and they were discriminated against simply because they were climate migrants who were moved from one part of the country to where they were as they tried to weave themselves into the economy and culture of California from those 6 states that I mentioned earlier. So think Grapes of Wrath, right? I'm going to fast forward to something that is more pressing and present memory for a lot of people now, particularly if you live in the Houston metro area. Hurricane Katrina was a disaster like we had never seen before in many of our lifetimes, depending on your age. And all of those folks who left after Hurricane Katrina, and many of them found their way down the interstate to Houston. They traded their New Orleans living, which is very particular and urban, for the sprawl of Houston. And they did so in record numbers. Again, about 250,000 people decided to settle instead of taking their chances and going back to their hometown and motherland, some of them would describe, of New Orleans. So holding these two things in parallel, looking at what happened with the Great Migration that was prompted by the Dust Bowl, and looking at what happened in Hurricane Katrina and what prompted that migration is where we are. And where they had Steinbeck, we've had so many works of artistic merit come out of the experiences of folks during Hurricane Katrina. Anything from Lil Wayne, a son of New Orleans, rapping about what happened with the flood, to Katori Hall's P-Valley, Beast of the Southern Wild was also inspired by that work. Work by Dewey Girard, King Esther, is another in the canon of great works that came because of this cultural moment. So this is the context of America's climate migrants. And I'd also be remiss not to mention folks who are moving from places that have become inhospitable to them because of wildfires or low-lying areas in parts of Florida and Miami in particular that have prompted calls and allegations of gentrification that's prompted by environmental circumstances, as the area Haiti, Little Haiti, is 13 miles above sea level, where many of the lower lying areas of Miami have experienced even dry flooding because of environmental changes. This land has become very sought after for developers and folks who want that Miami lifestyle without the threat of the sea coming to reclaim the land. And the folks in Little Haiti have experienced a lot of cultural and environmental gentrification because of that effect. So that's the first part of what has been playing in my brain for this little while now. And I know I've been saying a lot of words, so thank you for bearing with me as I'm just talking with you about this idea of what it means to be an environmental migrant and a climate migrant in the American context. The other part of that is the way that the media, when I say media, talking about the large corporate for-profit media in this country, has portrayed the idea and images of climate migrants and what it means to survive a natural disaster. You might recall Kanye West had some words at a telethon after the disaster that was Katrina, but I'd like to share an image with you that became famous from the Associated Press. Now, in this image, there's a depiction of two sets of two folks. Two of them happen to be black, the other set happened to be white. And this stirred a lot of controversy when, on the same day, just hours apart, AP chose to run these two images. Now, the image in the corner shows two people of color who were wading through water after looting a store, going away with groceries. And the contrasting image, posted just hours later, shows two people who are presumably white, they ain't black, wading through the same water after they had just found food in a store. So the contrast was there and apparent. If it was a person who was seeking to get some sustenance after the waters rose, they were looting and they were black, they were finding food if they happened to be white. A stupid mistake, a stupid caption, whatever it was, it really struck a chord and framed the way that a lot of the Katrina coverage was viewed by people who are both scholars of media as well as casual observers. So this also set off a wave of questions and really trying to decide what it is to be a climate migrant versus a refugee from a storm, a natural disaster that happened. And this is something that happened in Hurricane Katrina, and it's also something that's been happening in a more recent context with Hurricane Maria, as folks from Puerto Rico have made their way to the mainland, settling mainly in New York City, and some people have chosen to go to Florida. But this idea of what is a refugee versus a climate migrant. And Jesse Jackson spoke very poignantly in the Katrina context about those folks not being refugees, saying to refugee is to other. We're not others. We are American citizens who need help from our fellow American citizens. And just what it means to be a migrant versus what it means to be a refugee goes beyond the classification, but really looks at the heart of who we are as a country and how we treat those in need, both abroad and within the boundaries of our own nation. So the idea of community media is one that started many decades ago and really came to an understanding and coalesced in the late 80s, not the late 80s, I misspoke. In 1984, actually, the Cable Communication Policy Act paved the way for local governments across America, municipalities and states, to actually collect 5% of the gross revenues of the cable companies for their use of the public way. So in plain human English, when they get to use the streets and the resources that belong to you and I, the poles that they run fiber optics or cable wires from, they're going through the public way, so they should be used for the public good. So in 1984, the Communications Policy Act paved the way that a portion of their profits that come from subscribers like you or I, people who are paying every month, would be dedicated to making sure that programming on those channels was not strictly coming from corporate interests or entertainment conglomerates, that it had to have a certain portion that was provided for local coverage. Because if it was cable and they didn't have any access, the folks who were at home would lose the sort of connection that they have to the place where they live, and everything that you get to see and experience would be through this lens of someone who is a corporation or not really of your community. But I can tell you right now, today there are more than 1,500 community television stations operating on more than 3,000 channels across the country. So those are called PEG channels. It's public access, education, and governmental, but we're really focusing right now on the P in PEG, which is the public access. Now, we're beyond two ferns here. Public access is a weird and wacky place in all the best ways, in my opinion. If you turn on your TV at 2 a.m., no matter where you are, you're liable to see some far out stuff. But that's what it's for. It's your friends and neighbors going to a community center where they're learning how to engage and use media. And it might manifest itself in a guy in a star-spangled bikini dancing with a watermelon, which is something I've seen, or some really amazing programming that gets to the heart of matters. Actually, on the scale of star-spangled spandex bikini guy dancing with a watermelon to Emmy award-winning programming that chronicles what really happens in communities when the cameras leave for the majors, I've pulled a clip from a colleague of mine at Brick TV who happened to receive some recognition in 2017 from the Emmy Awards for this project that he did on someone who became subsequently a climate migrant after Hurricane Sandy hit the shores of Brooklyn. So I'll just leave you with a little taste of this and just wet your whistle for it a little bit. And I'll come back in a minute or so just so we can continue our talk. So here's a piece by Charlie Hoxie on what happened in Seagate, Brooklyn.
My father had built this house in 1971. My dad, he was a fisherman and owned a boatyard, exporter and transporting boats all over the country. And he loved this piece of property. It's called Norton's Point. It's on the end. When I was a kid, we had a 250-foot net. We used to sweep the beach and catch spearing. And he said to me, and I was a child, I never forget it, he goes, Sally, one day they're going to build a bridge. It's going to connect Brooklyn to Staten Island, and that's going to be in your living room because I'm going to build a house right behind you. And I was freezing. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. I got the flashlights. I'm pulling the nets. My father's screaming, God forbid the net gets dragged on the bottom and you cut the net with the pocket. And then the environment changed. My dad always told me, Sally, the seawall next to us, it's eroding, the seawall from Seagate. And they never constructed the seawall and reinforced the wall, which destroyed me, because my house, I'm on the end of the ocean, and we got totally destroyed. When Sandy came, it was a nightmare. I was swimming in my living room. There was 10 feet of water in the living room. He ripped apart everything. He ripped apart the floors, the staircases, the fireplace, all the Anderson windows. That was 3 years ago. That destroyed my life, destroyed my home, everything I worked for. That was where the pool is, but it's all buried now in sand. The pool was in that area there. I mean, the pool's not so important now, but I mean, it buried it all in sand. No water running up here. For the first year, I lived homeless. I slept in my truck. I stayed at people's houses. I paid them money to stay there.
So, as I said, that was just one peek at what it's like to engage with community media on a subject that has become something narrative when we think about survivors of these storms, and to a larger extent as well, climate migrants. The story of disaster survivors has been one of resilience, and that's something that the popular media or corporate media has really run with, this idea of failed response and resilience. The story of we'll do better, but look at how tough we are, and we made it through, and we'll be ready, and it'll be better next time in the way that we respond. So that has become the broader narrative of what's accepted in the larger body. But if we look at the way that the folks in the community media landscape have told the story of resilience and climate migrants, it's one of being integrated into communities. The folks down in Houston, Texas, at their local access center have had so many conversations and roundtable discussions about mental health, as well as education and legal matters and FEMA and trailers and the trauma that comes from being a survivor of a natural disaster. And these are the kinds of things that are absent from the broader conversation that would go unsaid and unnoticed were it not for community media. There's actually something that community media does very well at its core. And in order for democracy to flourish, people have to be active participants in the government, educated to think critically and free to express themselves. Now, I can't take credit for that quote, but it is something that is one of those things when you hear it, you know it to be true. So how many things can we all think of collectively that are at once global, local, and accessible? And that's really the mandate of what it means to be in a community media hub. There's an organization called the Public Media Alliance, and they advocate for public service media worldwide. And many of these places rely on a mix of public funds as well as foundation money and giving from viewers like you. You've all heard that call before, right? But we're looking at community media specifically in the ways that public access work. But the threat that public access faces is very real right now, because a formula that is being tampered with that's been established since 1984 when the franchise agreement, which is what it was called, which is what it said, the money that keeps the lights on essentially with the revenue share from the cable companies. There was an FCC chairperson who decided to reinterpret some of the language, and there was a risk of community media centers losing money because of the in-kind services, meaning when a cable company has the lines and they're feeding them to your local police, or they bring cable into the educational space in your library or your kid's classroom, they are giving those in kind. So they want to switch the program or switch the way that things are calculated to say these in-kind services can be taken as a monetary substitute for the formula that was already worked out. So that's the greatest threat right now to the way that public access works as we know it. So I think there might actually be a question right now that would give me a break from talking so much if you guys want to know something. Is there a question, Aziz?
So, as there are going to be a lot more climate migrants, obviously in the near and not so near future,
Right.
Are there ways that you think corporate media should be covering them that they're not?
There definitely will be more climate migrants, and we're seeing that all the time, whether it's this issue of urban heat that we're experiencing in so many built environments, or from folks who move down to Arizona and realize it's hot and you're running an air conditioning at 115-degree days, 7 days a week. And it's just not sustainable, folks. Like, hello, 20 summers from now, where are we going to be? You want to be in Arizona with the heat wave, or you want to be on the coast with the water coming in? So one thing that corporate media, for-profit media, can learn from the community-centered approach is to be there, to tell the stories, to give a fuller explanation and introduce neighbors to neighbors, because that's what community media does at its best, to give people the space to answer questions and to ask the questions like you did from people who want to know and just don't want to be sold to. And I think that the responsibility is ours, and we have to make sure that we're supporting our local, independent, and community-driven media while also holding accountable the people who are selling to us and popping up on your phone and giving ads and getting into your feed and your timeline. So support your community media wherever you are. You're not far from a community media center where you could engage, but you can also reach out to the folks at the news and say, I don't like this. Where is this coverage? This is something that's important to me and my community and my family. Don't just Skype in and parachute in 10 years later after the storm and tell me what's cleaned up and what's fixed. This is a steady drumbeat that has to grow louder with all of our help.
So here's another question. How did the COVID pandemic and the quarantines impact the advancement or retrenchment of community media?
Thank you for that question. Community media is something that is predicated on community. Being able to be in a room, being able to have a dialogue, and I don't think that many of us realized how important that process is until it was something that we were removed from. At the beginning of this, and I'm glad that you're still with me if you were here from the beginning. At the beginning, I talked about what an enormous gift it is to be able to be here at 20 Summers and have the space to think about ideas, but one of the best parts was also being able to dialogue with creative people who run the program, as well as my fellow resident here. And the ideas that happen when you get into the room and create space for that is something that's phenomenal. And that's what community media does. I often likened it to a Star Wars outpost bar, where you've got the guy who puts on his storefront church video that runs at 2 a.m. next to a woman who wants to do yoga and give people get their chakras aligned, next to someone who wants to tell you about a theory about aliens, and all of these people who have no business being in a room together do come together, and their practice is enhanced by that. So that's a long way of saying that COVID made us realize the importance of those spaces, and I hope it galvanizes people to become more involved in their community media and more active consumers of it, and let people know how important it is, because we were separated physically by COVID, but our ideas didn't stop. And I hope that all of that creativity and those thoughts that were bottled up and in your space, now you'll feel free to engage with them, whether it's via Zoom or getting into the room and making a freaky show with your friends. Just do it. You are at the moment that you do it. And there's a very low bar to entry for free or very low cost classes. So the only thing missing from community media is you, frankly.
I have a question, Brian.
There's a question.
What do you, what community media organizations do you recommend people kind of seek out if they want to get involved?
The best community media organizations are the ones that are wherever you are. I'm in Provincetown right now, and I've passed the radio station, and I've seen the signs for the community access TV. So that's the best one that I've seen so far. unless I'm in Brooklyn and I'm passing by Brick Arts Media Brooklyn, which is the home of free speech television in Brooklyn, Manhattan Network. Like, there are so many places that are just waiting for you to walk through the doors. So community media is something that happens with you as a community. You take podcasting classes, you produce things, you learn animation, any number of things. The center in Houston is phenomenal. Philadelphia has such a robust program. Minnesota is one of the meccas of community media, and it really is wherever you are. And like I said, the bar to entry is very low, and you can tell your story. Like Dave Isay, who I had the great fortune of interviewing once at Brick Arts Media, said in his book that listening is an act of love. And if you engage that and walk in just with your open heart and your curiosity and starting a dialogue and a conversation in your community, it's more valuable than any other media that you could consume, in my opinion.
Mark Adams asks, migration pathways link disparate parts of the world, challenging a rethink of the bounds of community. So how can we bridge our local communities to the origin places of climate migration? How can we make global concerns mean something locally?
Mike, that is something that I was trying to get at from the beginning. And like I said, this is a work in progress. And when someone gives you the opportunity to begin to crack something that's been turning over in your head, and I hope we can come to some kind of resolution or answer to that question, because when I watched what was happening in Syria or in other parts of the world looking at migrants and knowing how it felt so far away, but just being conscious of how present that was in our very own country, where we're supposed to be so advanced and democratic and peace-loving and forward-thinking, and knowing that there are people suffering the real consequences of climate displacement and becoming migrants, that was something of concern to me. And I didn't see it present in much of the larger popular media. So I turned to my community and community media to see what was happening there and what the stories were of these people the day after the water receded, when someone wasn't throwing paper towels at them, when they had their homes in a state of repair and their psyches were still caught in the rising waters, in the floods, in the heat, in all of the things that make climate migration such a pressing issue that frankly isn't getting the attention and concern that it deserves, and frankly the aftercare that's required for the community to heal and weave people into the fabric of wherever they are. You spoke about those, or you asked about the sort of disparate nature of folks and these pathways that happen. Those pathways are well trodden, but we really have to see each other in order to mend those things, and community media is a way of seeing.
Martin Shirk asks, so if there was an inhibitor on community media from the pandemic, I would presume that there was a corresponding reduction in content. Has that resulted in reducing the access to community media? And in Provincetown, I would submit that The Independent is another example of community media out here.
The Independent, my favorite local newspaper. The Independent is great. I had a chance to speak with Saskia, and and this is here in Provincetown. The Independent comes out weekly. They're an independent, as the name would imply, in an environment that became a market for a large media conglomerate to come in and give you what their version of local news is. You'll still see high school sports scores and things of that nature in the other people's paper, but to really get at the heart of the community that's not beholden to corporate interest and ad buys, I suggest you seek out those local papers as well as those local channels. But to answer the question specifically, I don't think that the creativity that comes out of these media centers can be quelled by a pandemic. Work was still happening. people were checking out equipment. People were Lysoling or sanitizing, I should say. Lysol is not a verb. It's a product. But people were cleaning and sanitizing the equipment and passing it on. I know where I live in New York, the public library system set up a lending library for people to be creative and still continue their work in their practice by giving them access to free equipment to sort of lower the bar and make a wider point of entry for artists who were out there and didn't have access to a beautiful camera like the one that I'm using to come to you. So creativity didn't stop, but maybe our attention to it can be a little bit better, but the creativity didn't stop. It just took different forms. And I can't wait to see the forms of creativity that come across community media as a hothouse and an incubator. Like I spoke about the Grapes of Wrath and Dorothea Lange and the Guthrie being something that was sparked by the Dust Bowl experience and all of the things and creativity that came out of Katrina as a touchstone. And I'm looking forward to the expressions from Puerto Rico that happen with a vibrant culture that is sure to be responding to the hurricanes and the threats. So just like all those places, P-Town included, the creativity is there, and the local flavor is something that you have to really get and take directly from the tap before Hollywood comes calling, reworks it, and sells it back to you in a watered-down version. Like, drink from the tap directly from the source yourself. Don't buy it bottled later. It's here. So I've gone on for a while now. Thank you for bearing with me as I'm giving you a little glimpse into my process and some of the things that I'm working through. I hope that you found it of interest. But more than that, I really hope that you'll have this conversation with someone else and Google stuff. There's more things about climate migrants and migration out there. There's some very clear and present threats to the state of community media that have nothing to do with boredom capacity or the creativity of the communities where it's produced. It comes purely from some business interests that are really antithetical to the creative process. Although they would tell you they're being creative and selling you entertainment, you should really be involved in community media and look to the stories to reflect our community back to us. That's the beginning and the end of this thing. And I just really hope that we can have a dialogue and participate. I'll meet you in the comments section of any video that's posted from any community media center around the country. But go and just Google community media, put your zip code in, and find out where the local center is and see how you can become involved. It really is that easy. All right.